Well, hello. So glad we get the opportunity to continue our study of Ecclesiastes. We're getting into final stretch of the book. The preacher is making his really his final arguments. We're going to see in chapter 10, he draws some really strong contrast between wisdom and foolishness. We talked about how to Cahaba, wisdom does have limitations, and there are things to understand about wisdom. But I think here he drives the strongest point that wisdom is still the preferable thing. So we're going to go ahead and start then. In Ecclesiastes chapter 10, we're going to read verse 1 through 7. The preacher says, "Dead flies make a perfumer's oil stink, so a little foolishness is weightier than wisdom and honor. A wise man's heart directs him toward the right, but the foolish man's heart directs him toward the left. Even when the fool walks along the road, his sense is lacking, and he demonstrates to everyone that he is a fool. If the ruler's temper rises against you, do not abandon your position, because composure allays great offenses. There's an evil I have seen under the sun, like an error which goes forth from the ruler. Folly is set in many exalted places, while rich men sit in humble places. I have seen slaves riding on horses and princes walking like slaves on the land." And so the preacher brings up this contrast between wisdom and foolishness. And we see these contrasts a lot. We certainly see them consistently in the book of Proverbs, where you'll see this idea of wisdom does one thing and foolishness does another. I really like this idea in the very first verse. Dead flies make a perfumer's oil stink, so a little foolishness is weightier than wisdom and honor. The point there that he's making is not obviously that wisdom is less important than foolishness, but that instead it's almost kind of like our modern expression. If you've ever heard the phrase that I did many times growing up with my dad, that one, come on, don't do that, wipes out 10 attaboys. And it's this idea that you can do a lot of things right, but doing something wrong, doing something foolish can really impede what you're trying to accomplish. And I think that's the point that that the preacher is trying to make here, is that foolishness can really damage somebody's reputation. It can really damage their attempts to do things. And so foolishness is something to be very studiously avoided. It's something to be well aware of the problems that it can cause. And then just as another note that I think is just always important to see, because I have seen this shared so many times, if anybody ever quotes Ecclesiastes 10:2, "A wise man's heart directs him toward the right, but the foolish man's heart directs him towards the left." If anybody ever quotes that as a reason to vote Republican Party, please do not ever listen to anything they have to say on the Bible, because that is not what Ecclesiastes 10:2 is saying. Ecclesiastes Party has not been around since the days of Cahaba in the 7th century. But instead it is making the point that a wise man's heart directs him towards a consistent action. It directs him towards the right hand. And again, in this ancient culture, right-handed was considered to be kind of the norm, left-handed was considered to be the abnormal. And so you tended to have this idea of right and left being positive and negative. You see that consistently in the wisdom literature. And so a foolish man's person, it very consistently will lead him down the wrong path. But what's interesting is he then concludes this section, verse 5 through 7, noting that there's a problem that he's seen a lot, is that even though foolishness is clearly inferior to wisdom, he has also noticed that consistently sometimes life doesn't treat it like that. And sometimes the most foolish people are the ones that are exalted. And sometimes the ones who are the wisest, they're the ones who are ignored and are not paid attention to. He uses kind of this idea. I've seen slaves riding on horses and princes walking like slaves on land. This is one of the difficulties, one of the tensions that he sees, is that even though everyone would say wisdom is better than foolishness, sometimes life doesn't actually play out that way. And he advises, in your dealings with these things, be aware of that truth in life. Trey, what do you see here in this first 7 verses?
Yeah, I don't know that I heard that expression with the attaboys, but I thought that was really good. One of the things that we see going on here, first of all, we connect this back to chapter 9, where he's just ended by saying wisdom is better than weapons of war, but a sinner destroys much good. And so here's this principle that a little bit of wisdom, or rather a little bit of folly, can destroy much good. It can outweigh wisdom, can outweigh honor, can do a whole world of bad. One of the things that I really see here, especially as we get into verse 2, is that wisdom and folly, these aren't just intellectual traits or qualities that we have. They are qualities of the heart, really. that these are heart matters. And so it's not just, is this a smart person? Is this somebody who maybe has a higher or lower IQ than somebody else? No, how is this person's heart directed? That's really where wisdom and folly are worked out. And so again, part of what we need to recognize with these ideas of wisdom is to be wise is to be righteous. To be wise is to do what God would have us to do, and foolishness is everything else. One of the things I think that we see here in this contrast is something at least it shocks me as we get into verse 6, and there's a subtle change. So whereas in verses 1 through 4, the contrast is clearly between wisdom and folly, it switches to being between folly and riches. And the reason why that's important is because this is a subject that the preacher has brought up time and time again, and he's going to say something, I think, rather surprising at the end of this chapter along those lines. But there's a shift, a subtle shift, where now the contrast is between folly and riches. And so riches are sort of taking the place of wisdom here. And I think that is important for what he's trying to set up and what he's going to do. Ultimately, wealth is going to be the sort of the ground through which he tries to tease out, okay, does this give an answer? Remember, his whole thing is trying to understand where are the answers in life found. And so now he's going to contrast folly with riches. And the interesting thing he says here is that these... Siri wanted to jump in on that. Maybe she has something to add, maybe she doesn't. But what the preacher says here is that the riches sit at the low place, while the slaves are on horses and the princes are on the ground like slaves. And there's this issue within leadership, within the ruling class, where not the people that we might expect to be ruling aren't the people that are actually ruling. And so that creates area, that creates space for injustice to take place. And he's going to have more to say about this idea of rulers toward the end of this as well. Greg, do you have any last thoughts on this section?
I think that verse 2 and 3 really hold the key to the entire wisdom folly problem. In verse 2, a wise man's heart inclines him to the right, but a fool's heart to the left. What is the difference in a wise man and a fool? Well, on the one hand, it's obviously that phrase, that description, but the heart is the difference. What is the distinguishing factors? What does one do? A wise man takes the correct path. The fool takes the incorrect path. In fact, how bad is it? Well, verse 3, even a fool, even when he's walking on the road, he still lacks sense, but what happens? He still says to everyone that he is a fool. Our actions determine who and what we are, and if we're willing to pay attention even a little bit, we can see what we are and we can see how others handle themselves. As the writer of Ecclesiastes would point out, there are all kinds of wise people who face tough problems. There's all types of foolish people who seem to have rewards or even be rulers in places of power. The truth is that we are who we decide to be. And so if I want to be wise, I have to train my heart. If I want to be a fool, I can let myself do whatever I feel like, do what comes natural, live selfishly, just do whatever I feel like at the moment. And from a life point of view, it may work for a little bit. It might be that God's favor shines on me in the sense that nothing terrible happens to me. But ultimately, what does the writer continually get back to? This world is not our home. God does see things. He is watching, and he will take care of those who are foolish and those who are wise, respectively, to what they deserve based upon his commands. And so let's pay attention, make sure that I'm not the fool, make sure that I'm walking in wisdom, training my heart, training my thoughts, guarding that gate to the soul, and also making sure that I show discretion and wisdom in how I look at and see other people. Well, let's continue the reading in verse 8. He who digs a pit will fall into it, and a serpent will bite him who breaks through a wall. He who quarries stone is hurt by them, and he who splits logs is endangered by them. If the iron is blunt and one does not sharpen the edge, he must use more strength. But wisdom helps one to succeed. If the serpent bites before it is charmed, there is no advantage to the charmer. The words of a wise man's mouth win him favor, but the lips of a fool consume him. The beginning of the words of his mouth is foolishness, and the end of his talk is evil madness. A fool multiplies words, though no man knows what is to be, and who can tell him what will be after him? The toil of a fool wearies him, for he does not know the way to the city. Woe to you, O land, when your king is a child and your princes feast in the morning. Happy are you, O land, when your king is the son of the nobility and your princes feast at the proper time for strength and not for drunkenness. Through sloth the roof sinks in, and through indolence the house leaks. Bread is made for laughter, and wine gladdens life, and money answers everything. Even in your thoughts, do not curse the king, nor in your bedroom curse the rich, for a bird of the air will carry your voice, or some winged creature tell the matter. Andrew, what do you see as we conclude chapter 10? What stands out to you in this section of verses?
Yeah, so we see again the preacher is talking a lot about this contrast between wisdom and folly. And it's interesting to see how he uses these couple of examples in the first few verses, digging a pit, a serpent, quarrying stones, splitting logs. He's making the point that there is risk to every activity. There is always the chance of danger. And the point that he's making is not that wisdom negates that wisdom prevents you from facing risk, but he extols wisdom as had the advantage of giving success. It has the advantage of letting you know what things may be at risk, because he makes a point, if the serpent bites before being charmed, there's no profit, there's no advantage for the charmer. You can know how to do something, but if it doesn't successfully get done, then it doesn't matter how much you do. And so wisdom kind of gives us the added benefit, not the guarantee, but the benefit of understanding how best to approach our labor, how best to approach this thing that, again, the preacher has said is the essence of man, the idea of being content with your lot in life and working hard for the sake of the Lord. And so the best way to do that is by wisdom. And so really, I think the preacher is using this entire section to show us that wisdom is the answer to what he has been advising everyone to do, as he's been talking about the need for being content, being peaceful, living a quiet life. Wisdom is the answer for that. We see that again even in the next couple of sections as he talks about the difference between the words of the wise and the words of the foolish. That again, wisdom tells you how to be productive, how to be efficient in your speech. And it's the idea that wisdom brings benefit both to the speaker and to the hearer. But if you've ever been trapped in a meeting with somebody who doesn't know what they're talking about, it is one of the worst experiences both for the speaker and for the listener. And then he concludes this idea with wisdom of being a benefit even in the relationship of figures of authority. And he draws this contrast between, a young king, a king who has not had the training and the upbringing that a typical royal would, but instead a king who is noble, who has been trained in these things, and who is able to control his princes to eat at the appropriate times. That wisdom from basically top down, from the humblest of workers to the teacher all the way to the king, wisdom makes all of these things better. Now, this is in the context that he's brought up in the first 9 chapters, that wisdom has limits. Wisdom doesn't give us every answer that we might look for. It doesn't answer all of these tensions that he's brought up in the text. But what it does tell us is that wisdom is better than foolishness, that wisdom should be pursued, and that the only way that we're going to be able to follow the advice of the preacher and live this quiet life of contentment is if we do so by wisdom. And so again, and I think that's one of the traps you can fall into, is from the secular perspective of thinking, well, wisdom doesn't matter, foolishness doesn't matter. The preacher's not a nihilist. He doesn't say nothing matters. He's just saying that you're not going to answer all the questions of life. So be content with the wisdom that God has given us, and so live your life according to that wisdom. Trey, what do you see in this section?
Yeah, I think we see some of that limitation with wisdom here, particularly in verses 8 and 9, where we've got sort of these traditional motifs of digging pits and breaking through walls, and probably we need to understand that in terms of doing something bad, so in order to harm someone. So we often read in the Bible about somebody digging a pit for somebody else so that they fall into it and get hurt. But as the proverb writer will say, the person who digs a pit is really digging it for themselves. This idea of breaking through a wall, it's like you're breaking into somebody's house or a city to try to steal or take something, and yet ultimately it's going to come back on you. And so there is this sort of character consequence sort of framing to the world, shaping to the world, that seems to work out in most occasions. And yet then we get to verse 9, he who quarries stones is hurt by them, and he who splits logs may be endangered by them. And so it's not always the case that you're doing something bad and then something bad happens to you. Sometimes there's just accidents that happen. And so wisdom really can't give you all the answers for that. and yet wisdom is still the better course. Andrew, as you were talking about the person who's in meetings and speaking things that they don't know about, I think about that song that you and I both know very well, 10,000 Words by the Avett Brothers. Ain't it like most people, we love to talk on things we don't know about. And that's kind of this picture we have here of this fool who just talks and talks and talks, but doesn't really know what he's saying, where it's going to end up. He's just trying to fill the space and fill the void. Maybe we've all been there at times. I don't know. But that's just kind of what came to my mind as you were saying these things. And then ending here with this idea of again, kingship and rulers and princes and how things ought to be, that the king needs to be someone who's wise, somebody who's mature, somebody who has thought things out. And the princes or the rulers, they need to be people who are diligent to their task and who are not just given to excess and partying whenever. And so they're feasting and they're drinking for the purpose of just reveling in that, rather than, verse 17, rather than for the strength that is necessary for them. And when we've got a government like that, when that is where our ruling class is, things are not going to go very well for the state or for the nation, for the kingdom. And I'm sure there are things that we could draw from that in modern day application, but I'll save that for now. What I want to comment on, especially here, is verse 19. Because we read verse 19 and it says, bread is made for laughter and wine gladdens life. And these things sound good to us. It sounds like what the preacher has already said in some of his Carpe Diem passages. So enjoy the good things that God has given us. Make the best use of our time, so on and so forth. Then when we get to the end of verse 19, I don't know about you guys, but it really shocks me. Money answers everything. And the question is that, are we meant to take that statement at face value? And the way that I read this text, especially with that contrast that we saw at the beginning, where he's now sort of subverted.
I'm not sure I understand.
Where he's serious, Siri trying to get in on this conversation.
Siri thinks this is a tough passage as well. She'd like you to explain it a little bit further.
I don't know if you guys at home can hear that, but my watch Siri keeps jumping into our conversation. Anyways, especially considering the slight subversion earlier of the sort of the traditional contrast between the two ways of wisdom and folly, but now it's riches and folly. And so he's setting up this idea that riches really are the answer for everything. Money answers everything. And for us who are very biblically literate, that should come as a shock. Particularly those of us who we read about the evils of money and the fact that money does not really answer and cannot satisfy fully. But then we get to verse 20. It says, even in your thoughts, do not curse the king, nor in your bedroom curse the rich, for a bird of the air will carry your voice, or some winged creature will tell of the matter. Listen, money answers everything, so don't upset those who have it. Don't upset those who are ruling. You got to stay in their good graces, because if money truly is the answer to everything, you need to be right with those who have it. I think that's going to be really important as we go on to chapter 11. But before we get there, Greg, you have any last thoughts here?
Yeah, I think in verse 12 to 15, we learn a lot about how seriously God takes the distinction between a fool and someone who is wise. In verse 15, for example, the toil of a fool wearies him, for he does not know the way to the city. We live in a culture that is very much against any sort of bashing, unless it happens to agree with bashing somebody that I want to bash. But in general, we would say don't bash anybody. God doesn't really have that reservation. When it comes to scriptures, fools are always made out to be quite the bad guy, to say the least. So you look at this last phrase, he does not know the way to the city. We're not really familiar with that per se, that idea. This would be like saying that guy would get lost even if you put him on an escalator. Right, I'll let you think about that one and let it rise to the top of what it means. But as you look at verse 12 and 13, you really have this problem in understanding, how do we show wisdom? How do we just show that we're a fool? Well, verse 12, for one, the words of a wise man's mouth win him favor versus consumption. Right, so am I working to help better the people around me, or am I making it to where it's even worse? Am I creating a negative situation? Am I spreading bitterness, slander, these problems, complaints? And really, you look at that, it's pretty clear. Am I living for self or living for a higher purpose? This is the same concept in the Proverbs. Do you live for righteousness? Do you live for unrighteousness? This is the problem with Jesus's message. Do you sacrifice for Christ or live for self? We have to choose a lane and choose a side. And in verse 13, the beginning of the words of his mouth is foolishness. The end of his talk is evil madness. A fool multiplies words. But also notice this last part. And this is a particular insult to God when you look at the New Testament in particular. Though no man knows what is to be, and who can tell him what will be after him? When speaking of the future, a fool is said to, verse 14, multiply his words. And so if you look at this multiplication of words, this is saying, I have an assurance of the future. The only thing we should know is that as Christians, we have an obligation to make sure we walk our way up the stairway to heaven. We need to understand that no matter what we're facing in this life, we have to live for God. Make sure we're moving the right direction. A fool says, on the other hand, that, well, it's okay. I know what's going to happen. Maybe we should take some pages from James and say, if the Lord wills. The understanding of the apostles that even Paul, when he'd say he wanted to visit his brethren, he'd say, if the Lord wills. If anyone could be assured of making out an important life mission, it would be Paul. And yet he was preoccupied with if the Lord wills. Do we live for God? Do we live for self? That'll come out in our speech. It'll come out in our pathways. And God has no problem in calling out a fool. So I better make very certain that I'm not one of those fools. Trey, will you read chapter 11, verse 1 through 6?
Yeah, absolutely. Chapter 11, beginning in verse 1, it says, cast your bread upon the waters, for you will find it after many days. Give a portion to 7 or even 8, for you will not know, or for you know not what disaster may happen on the earth. If the clouds are full of rain, they empty themselves on the earth. And if a tree falls to the south or to the north, in the place where it falls, there it will lie. He who observes the wind will not sow, and he who regards the clouds will not reap. As you do not know the way the Spirit comes to the bones in the womb of the woman with child, so you do not know the work of God who makes everything. In the morning sow your seed, and at evening withhold not your hand. For you do not know which will prosper, this or that, or whether both alike will be good. Cast your bread upon the waters. I don't know what you guys think about that, but I remember those occasions. Did you guys do this where you went out and you fed the ducks and you just threw bread out to them? Apparently you're not supposed to do that. I think that like bloats their stomach or something. So I learned that here just recently, actually. But that's the picture that comes to my mind, and it's sort of this nonsensical picture. What are you doing, casting your bread upon the waters? It doesn't really seem to resonate with us. Probably the idea here is that of maritime trade. So you're trading with foreign nations, and you don't know how it's going to work out. And yet, maybe after some time, you're going to see the fruit of that. And so when we get into verse 2, really, that I think confirms this. Give a portion to 7 or even to 8, for you do not know what disaster may happen on earth. He's talking about diversifying your trading efforts, diversifying your assets, if you will. And as we think about all of this, that seems really trite, and it just doesn't really seem to fit with what we've been talking about. The preacher is looking for what is the answer to life? How do we live life under the sun? Well, just diversify your assets, and that doesn't really seem to fit unless we understand what he's just said back in chapter 10 and verse 19, and that is that money is the answer to everything. And if money is the answer to everything, and that therefore I've got to make sure I'm in good graces with the kings and the rich and the rulers and all of that, I've also got to be wise so as to spend my money well, to make trade well, because ultimately money is going to be the answer for everything. But then we come to verse 6, and he says, okay, so go and you work hard, and you sow in the morning, and you continue to work in the evening, but then you don't know what will prosper, this or that, whether both alike will be good. And so there is, even with wealth and money that is supposedly the answer to everything, there is this enigma. There is this darkness that we cannot see, we cannot know. It's ultimately not going to be the answer. At least that's how I read this passage. Greg, maybe you have some different thoughts on this.
Yeah, I really think that when you look at verse 6, for example, there's some powerful application for us. And so we'll serve this as both an application section and going through the text. And there's really this escalation of what he's been talking about all throughout the book of Ecclesiastes. In verse 6, in the morning sow your seed, and in the evening withhold not your hand, right? In both cases, be spreading the seed. Well, why? You do not know which will prosper, this or that, or whether both alike will be good. The truth of the matter is, when we face uncertainty in life, and that is going to happen, we have a choice. Do we sit back and do nothing? Well, verse 4 would indicate that's probably not the best idea. Sitting back and being apathetic doesn't help. Does holding up our hands and complaining about it help? Well, of course not. Does acting foolishly or rashly help? No, of course not. And so when you come to verse 6, really, you have this idea of what do we do when we don't know? Redouble your efforts, trust God. When we think about our entire purpose of this life, it is redouble your efforts, sacrifice self, serve God first. And really, when you look at verse 2 and 3, that helps it fall into place. Give a portion to 7 or even to 8, for you know not what disaster may happen on earth. The clouds are full of rain, they empty themselves on the earth. And if a tree falls to the south or to the north, in the place where the tree falls, there it will lie. Again, he who observes the wind will not sow, and he who regards the clouds will not reap. We are called to action. We're called to wisdom. So never just sit back. One of the most effective tools of the devil is to discourage us into sitting on the sidelines. He does this with Elijah in the case of Mount Carmel. He takes one of God's greatest servants and doesn't make him an atheist, doesn't make him a prophet of Baal, but he gets him in chapter 19 on the sideline. He's in a cave. He's saying, I'm all alone. Well, he's not doing good for God there. And I don't either when I get so preoccupied with how life's unfair, how I'm not in control of my circumstances, that sometimes I not only just do the wrong thing, I might just do nothing. God says the wisdom of the ecclesiastical writer is do good things. Work hard. Trust that God will take care of you. And so as we look at this, we really have to decide, what am I doing today? Have I served God to the best of my ability? Am I speaking wisely? Am I serving wisely? Or am I living as a fool, selfishly pulling out my days, doing whatever I think is best? Andrew, what do you see in this section as we go towards wrapping up both chapter 11 and some overall finishing touches?
Yeah, I think, the preacher is really drawing his conclusions. He's going to start in verse 7 with really his conclusions. So we're going to take next time through 7 all the way through the end of chapter 12. It's kind of preacher's closing speech. But I think he's almost kind of guessing a little bit of a final note here before he gets to the conclusion, that it would be really easy upon hearing all of the preachers talk about, there is going to be injustice. There's going to be people in positions of power that are foolish, like he just talked about in chapter 11. You're going to have to deal with people who don't know when to stop talking. You're going to deal with the random chance of life where sometimes things aren't going to go well, even if you did do everything right. And so it would be really easy, I think, for somebody to read all that and just become paralyzed by indecision, kind of like what Greg is talking about. And that's what he's bringing to the point out in verse 4. He says, he who watches the wind will not sow, and he who looks at the cloud will not reap. If you're waiting for the perfect sign from the heavens to say this is the right moment to do everything, it's never going to happen. There's never a clear indicator in life that, okay, everybody says now's the time to do things. And so the answer to that is not to become paralyzed by indecision and just say, well, I don't know what to do. The point of this book is not to say, okay, we'll just become really fearful and just become so concerned with everything that you can't go forth and do stuff. Instead, the point is in verse 5 that he draws, he goes, you don't know the path of the wind. You don't know how children are formed in the womb of pregnant women. Remember, they didn't have ultrasounds during this time, so that's a very true statement for them. You don't know the activity of God who makes all things. Really drawing on a very strong point he's made the past couple of chapters. You don't have all the answers. But that doesn't mean that you just don't do anything. It doesn't mean, as Greg said, you throw up your hands and say, I quit. It means, as the preacher said so many times, and as he's about to kind of wrap up and conclude, he makes the point, go do. My advice is still sound. Go sow your seed. Go do your work. You don't know what's going to happen. So just go do. And that's all that you're in control of. You can't control the end result of these things, but you can control what you do with your time in this moment right now. That's really, I think, one of the ultimate points that he's making in this whole chapter, really all the way from chapter 10, verse 1, all the way through 11, verse 6, is that, do the best you can. You're not going to always get it right. Wisdom is better than folly, but sometimes even wisdom's not going to direct you to the final conclusion you might want. So just go do the best that you can. Trey, what do you see as final applications here?
Yeah, I guess as I'm reading this chapter and trying to wrestle with the perspective that the preacher has given us, and just remembering that he has at times sort of given us these contrasting perspectives as he's wrestled with the questions of life, and as he's dealing with this subject of wealth here, and kind of replaces wisdom with wealth and puts that in the place of that, the question I want to ask myself is, what am I replacing? What am I putting as the answer to everything in this life? If I'm I think what he's exploring here, if I'm putting wealth or my money or my possessions or my status or my position or my pleasure, whatever I'm putting as the answer to life that's not wisdom and fearing God, that is ultimately going to come up incomplete. I'm ultimately going to be unsatisfied. I'm not going to sow. I'm not going to reap. I will not find what I am looking for, even if I work very hard in those efforts. And so I do very much appreciate the points that you guys are making. Like, we need to keep working and we need to exert ourselves not knowing. But let's make sure we're working for the right thing and not seeking after something that really is not going to be the answer. And so it comes back to, where am I spending my time? Where is my mental energy, my mental space? Where is that being directed towards? What do I see as the answer? That's going to work itself out practically in my hands and my feet, the way that I'm walking. If I can look at those arenas, I can see really what I view as the answer to life. And maybe we'd be surprised to know that our answer is not what we think it is. Maybe it is wealth. Maybe it is position. Maybe it is pleasure, something along those lines. And so I want to wrestle with that for myself. And I'd encourage you at home to wrestle with that. What are you putting up as the answer to life? And if you're not escalating God to that position, then I think we've got it wrong. Well, Andrew, I appreciate you joining us together in this study, and I'll throw it back to you to close things out here.
Absolutely. Like I said, continue to appreciate you guys' good work for the Lord and good work in this study. So we're going to have one more session on this. We're going to finish out the second half of Ecclesiastes 11. He's going to start to kind of introduce his closing thoughts, and then Ecclesiastes 12 will get not just the preacher's closing thoughts, but also, if you remember all the way back to the introduction, that narrator that we talked about, who's actually been the one that seems to have compiled all these teachings. We're going to get his closing thoughts on the matter as well. Probably the most famous verse of Ecclesiastes in chapter 12. So thank you guys both for joining us for this study. We're going to, hopefully, Lord willing, be able to meet again next time with Ecclesiastes 11:7 through the end of 12. Thank you guys so much for joining us for the study. We'll see you again next time.